Hello, and welcome back to the Thomistic Institute podcast. My name is Father Gregory Pine, and I'm delighted to welcome you for another installment of Off-Campus Conversations, where we follow up with someone who has been speaking on this or that campus so that we can chase down some insights and just prolong that conversation. So I'm delighted for this episode to be joined by Father Anselm Ramelow. Thanks for joining.
Well, pleased to be here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Folks might know you from various contributions that you've made to Thomistic Institute chapters, which have then appeared on the Thomistic Institute podcast, or from other works here, there, and everywhere. But for those who don't know you, would you just say a word of introduction, who you are, where you're from, and what you do?
Yes, I'm Father Anselm Ramelow, and I'm from Germany originally, and did my doctorate under Robert Spemann in Munich years ago. And then I came to the United States to join the Dominican Order. And I'm teaching philosophy at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in Berkeley, California. And I have gotten into questions of AI, well, in a strange kind of way, because it isn't really my topic. I'm really a bit of a Luddite. And yet I was always aggravated by claims that computers can develop consciousness and that machines, can be people too. And so I started to develop a few responses to that, and then people kept asking, and so this whole topic kept growing. And I'm also now part of a think tank for the Vatican, for the Dicastery of Culture and Education, which we published a book too. It's called Encountering AI. So that's an ongoing kind of work for me, even though it's in some way not my primary topic, but as it is, there are the ages and the times that we live in, and the questions that arise from that, and so we'll have to respond to that. That's what Dominicans do.
Yeah, exactly. Before kind of diving into the theme of artificial intelligence, maybe just a couple words about your kind of formation. You spoke about studying with Robert Spemann in Munich. Many people will have heard of Robert Spemann, but perhaps some haven't. What led you to study there, and what was it about his work that attracted you to him as a mentor?
Well, it was in a way fortuitous. I studied in Munich just for a year, was in Freiburg in Germany originally, and I attended his seminars by recommendation of another philosopher, Max Müller, who became my sponsor for when I became Catholic. So when I started with Robert Spemann, I wasn't Catholic yet.
Okay.
And I still remember even defending Luther a little bit in some session, and he was very benevolent in response. But in any case, it helped me grow closer to Catholic understandings of things too, and eventually became Catholic. And then I ended up doing my doctorate with him. He was my introduction also to questions like personhood and the philosophical concept of personhood. He was one of the few upright intellectuals in Germany, speaking out against euthanasia and abortion, and public intellectual in many ways. And so it was a great example.
Okay. Yeah, I've encountered his work principally through First Things when he was still living, still publishing in that. But certainly I benefited from his clarity of thought and kind of methodology of exposition. Yeah. Are you originally from Baden-Württemberg? Are you originally from Bavaria?
No, I'm from the north. I was born in Hamburg and grew up a little northwest from there, partly even on an island in the North Sea. And then I studied in Freiburg in the southwest of Germany, and then also in Munich, where I did my doctorate.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. So then turning to the theme of artificial intelligence, I think that perhaps some listeners are well versed in what artificial intelligence is and how it can be deployed. My suspicion is that most of us have just kind of dabbled with like ChatGPT because we've heard that it helps you to title events, or it helps you to summarize texts, or it helps you to do whatever else that might be better accomplished there than with a search engine. But can you just say maybe a word of introduction when we talk about AI? What exactly are we talking about?
Well, I suspect you don't mean the technology. I wouldn't be an expert on that.
Yeah, no, yeah.
But what you mentioned with ChatGPT, one of these large language models, and you distinguished it rightly from search engines, which I think is very important. and I find people not really quite understanding that topic. Maybe one can characterize it precisely by that difference. So a search engine does lead you to actual information, whereas ChatGPT is built to give you some kind of a plausible response, whether it's true or not. It's not tracking truth or falsehood, but plausibility or sounding plausible. And so you cannot rely on it for access to reality. So it may help you to generate text that sounds plausible, but it doesn't give you proper information. Maybe just to mention my own first attempt, with ChatGPT was very revealing. I just had reread an old classical German novel, and I was puzzled by the last sentence in that novel. And so I thought, why not ask ChatGPT what it means, right? If it's so smart, maybe it has an answer. And so I asked that from the machine, and it gave some kind of a plausible answer, like, they're sitting around the fireplace, which means they will be also together in the future. Sounded good. Only there was no fireplace or anything in that novel. And so I asked again and said, well, then, I'm sorry. And then it revised its response and gave something that sounded a bit more plausible, but still was about the hero who was actually dead at the end of the story. So the interesting thing about that is it generates its responses based on information on the internet, including Wikipedia Commons. And Wikipedia Commons has the whole novel there. And so I quoted the last sentence to the machine finally and said, I'm sorry, and then gave another kind of response. But it didn't look up the sentence, which is what the first thing you would do. If you would try to answer that question, you would trace and track the information that's there. That's not what ChatGPT is doing. So it's really, I thought, always a good example of how it operates. And it is really what, I'm sorry for the term, what Harry Frankfurt calls bullshit, right? So it's not a term of abuse, it's actually a technical philosophical term. He wrote a book on bullshit, which is precisely that. It's bullshit is different from lying. If you lie, you are still interested in the difference between truth and falsehood. If you tell bullshit, you're just trying to sound plausible in a cocktail party or something like that. He meant that against, I think, postmodernism. That was before AI kind of things. And it's interesting that we build now machines that do what the culture at large does in postmodern kind of discourse, where you think there is no truth or falsehood anymore. It's just your own narrative, your plausible kind of patterning of your kind of impressions of your own life, and everybody lives in his own world that way. That's basically what that machine is doing. And so that's maybe one way to characterize what these large language models are, by contrast with, say, search engines like Google. So Google at least gives you good, or honest to goodness kind of information, but not what ChatGPT is doing to us.
Yeah. Okay, so against that backdrop, then, I think people will begin to appreciate how there are, involved ethical considerations at play. And already people have highlighted these in the journalistic setting or in the academic setting. And people will talk about the ethical implications for education, for instance, especially in institutions of higher learning where there's some expectation that your students would be able to compose, to edit, to formulate text in coherent fashion. I don't know, in your experience teaching at DSPT or in the wider GTU, or in your experience kind of examining these themes from your perspective and with your colleagues, what do you see are some of the ethical implications, or maybe some of the ethical questions that are raised by the development of the technology?
Well, so we are a graduate school, and I haven't encountered yet, serious cases where students submits a paper that was just written by ChatGPT. I think this is not just a matter for, you could ask a student, would you like to be treated by your teacher that way too, right? So if your teacher just answers your emails by ChatGPT automatically, I would be ghosting my students, right? I would be absent from them in so many ways. And likewise, if they submit a text like that, they would absent themselves from me. So what I'm trying to say with that is it is not just about information or text generation. It is about personal relationships as well that are undermined by that. You're disappearing to each other as a consequence. And you don't learn certain things, of course, too. I mean, we make our students write papers not just because we want them to give us the information, but because it helps them to understand the content, to formulate it, to write it, to actually think that through. And the same again is true for teachers. You know, people say, if you want to understand something really, I mean, teach it. Right? Well, why is that? Because if I have to formulate that, you know, I have to think it through for myself. And in the process of teaching, I realize that all the time, I get new ideas, I get my mind around things in a better way, and it grows on me. If I let a machine do that, it will never happen. And so we learn it's another example of, you know, whenever a machine learns a new skill, we lose it basically. You know? And whenever you have a new app on your phone, you know, another skill set bites the dust, you know. And so I would hate to see that ChatGPT is doing the same thing to learning in the classroom and writing papers and so forth. So I have yet to see any good use of AI in the context of teaching. Maybe you can suggest something, but any skill of not just even learning things, but self-expression, let's say, right? If you cannot learn to express yourself if you just let a machine do it for you. Let me give you another example. There was an example of a father who was getting ready for the wedding of his daughter. And so he had to give, you know, the usual father speech at the wedding ceremony. He said, oh, well, let's ChatGPT write it for me. I cannot think of anything and so forth. And so the machine wrote a nice little speech, you know, and then he decided not to use it. Why? Well, it would have sort of undermined the whole occasion. It wasn't about that. It wasn't really about sounding good or something like that. It was about his presence at the wedding of his daughter. And he would have been absent from that. What would she have thought if she knew it was a machine writing that instead? And so this is an example where it's clearly about personal relationships, but I do think that applies to education too. This is about, you know, teacher and student kind of interactions, the intersubjectivity that comes with that, what both learn in the exchange, and how they learn to interact and not be absent to each other. And so I think in many ways, these machines teach us how to be absent to each other in this context and in many others.
So I'm thinking of the last time that I used ChatGPT. That was all of a sudden difficult for me to say. I was in preparing a course on the virtue of courage, and I, you know, had some notion that it would be fruitful to search the pagan tradition on the virtue of courage as antecedent to the Christian tradition, but I didn't know exactly where to look. I had some vague sense that I ought to look in Homer, I ought to look in Plato, I ought to look in Aristotle, perhaps others besides, Macrobius and Cicero, but I wasn't going to get to those. And so I just asked ChatGPT where the best places to look were, and it furnished me with the information in a way that was somewhat coherent, and it limited the scope of my research. Now, I see that as kind of atoning for two sins. I mean, sins in the broadly conceived sense. The sin of my own lack of formation, and then the sin of my own time constraints. So I think that, like, while ChatGPT might make up for a lack of formation, it's not going to provide that formation. It's just going to make that lack of formation less evident, or it's going to produce whatever product or whatever end result is hoped for without necessarily changing the human agent. And then I think about the other standard is a kind of standard of efficiency. And I wonder if, you know, like, efficiency just means to be absent to, because the faster you do a thing, or the more hastily you do a thing, the less perhaps present you are to a thing. That's not to say that we all ought to be kind of proceeding through life in languorous fashion. But yeah, I do think about, I don't know, yeah, if you have particular thoughts on maybe this notion of formation or this notion of efficiency, the kind of human implications which come with, you know, the rapid advance of the technology.
Yes, I mean, so it's not just about efficiency. I mean, in efficiency, machines typically will beat us anyway. And I think that's not what we are looking for in our own formation either. I mean, so we really want to be able to express ourselves even independently from content, and learning that kind of skill that can be applied then to many other things. Now, I'm not opposed to doing searches on Google. I'm a little concerned that they now have an AI response coming up first, which is really blurring the boundaries between the media. But I mean, in the past, we also knew where to look up things, what kind of encyclopedias or bibliographies to use. Of course, you unlearn those kind of skill sets too. But so I'm not principally opposed to something that makes things more accessible. Any technology does that. Any technology extends our own skills. I think the problem is where technology doesn't extend our own skills, but replaces it and undermines our own skill. So if we lose our ability to do it on our own in important matters, there will be a problem that way. Now, for research, I mean, if you use ChatGPT for that, of course, you have to be careful, what it quotes to you, right? Because it makes that stuff up, right? So I was always wondering why people find it so difficult to trace the use of ChatGPT in research papers of students, because if you look at the footnotes and see what they quote, if it's by a machine, there's most likely something that's made up, bibliographical kind of entries and so forth, which doesn't exist. So you can easily check that part. And so it's not going to do that for you. So even the quick research kind of approach will produce problems. I never trust that. So I would rather use a search engine to do even that.
Okay. Then maybe thinking about this notion of formation, typically or on a kind of classical model, you perform an action. That action in its repeated performance builds up a kind of habit in the individual, and the individual then acts through that habit in future similar activities, and it proves, perfective, provided that it's in accord with right reason, and it's the type of thing which conduces to the end. Just thinking about virtuous formation. When it comes to the use of technology in general, or perhaps more specifically the use of AI, it sounds like it can be hard to thread that needle well, which is to say to lay hold of the instrument and deploy it for human ends, but to do so in a way that's ultimately humanizing, because it seems like the risk of some dehumanization is present when you replace the human element with a technological element. So, from this vantage of a virtuous formation, do you think that there are, particular ways in which people of goodwill can approach these technologies so as not to be undone by them or just kind of taken in by them?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe to take an example, how about elderly care? So there's increasingly a lack of personnel for elderly care, and so people replace it with robots. I mean, Japan is particularly in that. They sort of invest instead of insurance, basically, into a robot for their old age. And the question is not just what does that to the elderly, which is one thing. And so there's an epidemic of loneliness in the world, especially among the elderly. The UK has a minister for loneliness because there are people who haven't talked to other people for months, just sitting in their apartments. Is a robot going to replace that? Don't older people who have a life experience a right to be listened to by people who know what a life experience is? The machine doesn't. The machine doesn't have experiences. It's not just about monitoring temperature and blood pressure and things like that. It's a human relationship. So it does something to the elderly person, but it also does something to us. Do we want to become people who do not know anymore how to care for other people? That's a skill. That's a virtue that you can develop. And if you outsource that to machines, you will lose that skill yourself. Do we become then a society that doesn't know how to care for each other? So that's an important scenario within elderly care, which is much discussed in the use of robots and AI in that context. And it's an example that may then apply in many other contexts. Apparently, something where AI works well is suicide hotlines. And I think it's used for VAs and so forth. That so it is effective in the first response, apparently, even if people know that they're just talking to a machine. So it just gives them a feedback, to think through where they are at. And it can be important because there's a high burnout rate among people who are responding on these kind of hotlines. So that can be good, perhaps as a first response, if you have nothing else to work with, right? But what is if that's the only response? So somebody who is picking up or calling that hotline, knowing they will ever only talk to a robot, that would be rather depressing, right? I think it would actually make the suicide rates go up eventually rather than down. So there are initial benefits for use of robots in, virtuous skills that we want to have, but they cannot totally replace it. So another kind of example would be machines can support us in, say, helping to lift an elderly person, for example, when we are not strong enough. Let's say we have an exoskeleton or something that helps us to do that. That would support our own skills rather than replacing it. It will still keep us close to that person. So the question is, how can we build this kind of technology that it supports our skills and our virtues without replacing them? So one doesn't have to be entirely opposed to any kind of use of AI, obviously, but you have to figure in how it works with our own skills and supports them.
Yeah. Maybe to speak more broadly, like kind of as we observe changes in the human community, 19th century, 20th century, 21st century, part of which is kind of historical, part of which is kind of genealogical. What are the kind of human perfections to which or towards which we should be especially attentive kind of in this period of transition as technological progress kind of ramps up or accelerates? I suspect that there's a kind of risk that certain human perfections are eclipsed or potentially forgotten. And it seems like you made mention of this notion of intersubjectivity. It sounds like relationship has come up a variety of times in the conversation. I don't know, could you speak to, some of the human perfections that you think are at risk and how we might cultivate them?
Yes, so I think what we're talking about here are moral skills and virtues. These are human perfections of the most important kind. There are two kinds of skills: there are technical skills and there are moral skills. The moral skills is what we call virtues. Technical skills could be, how to repair a car or how to play the piano or something like that. All of these we develop by practicing things, by repeatedly doing certain things. Otherwise, we don't have these skills. So that's one reason why you don't want to outsource everything to computers, because you will never acquire these virtues. Now, if you take the moral and the technical skills, they're actually not disconnected. So let me give you an example. Self-driving cars. So I live in San Francisco. We have these robo cars driving around already, looking eerie because there's nobody behind the wheel. But let's say all of society suddenly would only use self-driving cars. Immediately, we would lose the technical skill of driving. But I think we would also lose something else. We would lose the responsibility that comes with that. So driving a car makes you dangerous. You can do a lot of harm by bad driving. Right? And so that's why people tell you, well, it's the human factor that's the problem. Let's just get rid of the human factor and let machines do it. The algorithms are much better at driving than we are. You can hear that all the time now. But that's not the question, I think. The question is it perhaps important for us to be dangerous? Just to put it a little bit strangely. Is it important for us to be able to do harm? If we are not having that ability, we never learn responsibility. So parents, for example, will at a certain point perhaps give their children a pet to care of and have real responsibility, but also the ability to do harm to that animal. But it's a low entry kind of thing to teach them how to care for another being. And then eventually perhaps to take care of their younger siblings or something like that. Now, if we are driving, we have to take care of our fellow human beings on the road, pedestrians and other drivers. We have to learn courtesy, we have to learn patience and all these other kind of good things that we don't learn anymore if that's go away. I mean, where do we learn these things better than in traffic, right? We all know about that. Perhaps there will be other kind of scenarios in which we can learn that, but they will maybe then also equally eliminated by machines. So without the technical skill, we unlearn our moral skills as well. They're connected. There's an interesting kind of theological connection here. So Richard Swinburne, for example, makes it as part of the theodicy argument that God needs to give us responsibilities to learn to be a responsibility. And that happens only if we also have the ability to do harm. That's why there is suffering in the world, because if God doesn't allow us to be dangerous in some way, he also will not allow us to grow up and become people with moral skills, basically. So I think technology is doing something similar. It doesn't allow us to grow up. In an ultimate kind of scenario, you have predictive AI now. And so, I mean, they trace what we do on the internet. They know all the things we like and so forth. And sometimes before we even know ourselves, right? They know us better than we ourselves. We don't even know what we want. Already Amazon is presenting to us what we might like, and that they may also be manipulating us in that way. But let's say you automate this whole kind of process, even for ourselves. So right now, I still have to click on Amazon what I want to buy from the suggestions. But what if I allow the machine to make that choice for me already? So even before my own wishes arise beyond the threshold of consciousness, the machine already knows what I am going to want and already order it for me and supply me with it. At that point, we become sort of moral zombies, right? Because there's no consciousness, therefore also our free will is not involved. We never make choices, we never make decisions. We never develop the moral skills that come with decision making. We are just, living in the machine that, is putting us in this comatose state in which any kind of desire we have is already taken care of even before we become conscious of it. That's a very dystopian scenario for me. That is, should I say, I mean, that's sort of the apex of where things may be headed, if we stay on the trajectory that we replace human beings with machines wherever we can.
Maybe in just the last kind of segment here, we might talk about not like eschatological implications. That sounds a bit too dire, but certainly in science fiction, you have a trope whereby you kind of play out the implications of a technology to the nth degree. You set those terms, and then you see what kind of becomes human norm in light of these new conditions. So I guess maybe to kind of project things out into the future, what do you see are potential threats, or what do you see are potential opportunities that we in 2024 can look forward to and maybe work towards or advance at present?
Well, there's always the possibility of computers taking over the world and the singularity or something like that. I don't believe exactly in the singularity, but even without computers becoming conscious, which I don't think is a possibility, they can be dangerous. If they are there to optimize certain kind of purposes that we build into them, let's say like preserving the planet, from the ecology and so forth, they may conclude that human beings are the problem and eliminate them. So there are science fiction movies of that sort. So that could be one eschatological scenario. there are more short-term kind of things that we just talked about that I'm more concerned with. There could be, horror scenarios in warfare, automation of warfare, drones making autonomous decisions and so forth, which are being discussed, and people predicting that it all happens so fast you cannot do it otherwise. You have to let the machine make autonomous decisions and all that. That sounds like, future wars will be just each side pushing a button and then let the algorithms battle it out, basically in seconds, basically. That is a kind of thing I've been thinking about just a few years ago. In the meanwhile, the war in the Ukraine broke out, and what do you have? You have good old-fashioned trench warfare and things like that. It's not really what one would expect, although there are drones involved. So I'm not quite sure the kind of projections from some of these scenarios, how plausible they really are. You can take it a little further if you talk about eschatology. How about eternal life, right? How about our own eternal aspirations, eschatological aspirations? And maybe two thoughts on that. So one is transhumanism, right? So the transhumanists are very much in love with that kind of technology and hope to have some kind of eternal life based on machines. So you can upload yourself into a machine and can perpetuate yourself as like a computer program, being handed down to the ages in ever better hardware or something like that. And so you continue your existence in that kind of way. That in some way is, of course, playing God in some way, becoming like God without God, as Pope Francis recently said. And this is taking eschatology in our own hands. Now, it of course presupposes that you can upload consciousness into machines. So I don't think that's a real possibility, but it affects our imagination and our way of thinking about things, including, one may suggest, even avoiding God. I mean, it has been another suggestion people made. If you want to avoid the last judgment or your personal judgment, you just perpetuate yourself in this world with the help of machines, basically. So you never have to face God, basically. You're ghosting God in some way. And so I think that can play in unhealthy ways with our own mind and basically shortchanging the true goal that we have to be with God. If we could you can have some funny thought experience about that too. If you can make consciousness, right, and replicate people and machines that way, how about if we replicate a saint and replicate it here on Earth? Would the saint cease to be in heaven at that point? Or does the saint exist twice? What about personal identity here, right? It's like these teletransporter thought experiments. Would the saint in heaven die or be on Earth again or something like that? So there's some things that don't work if you think of that as a replacement of our true destiny in heaven. Now, for me, there's a certain kind of consolation to think about heaven in this context, because it tells us there are certain things that a machine will never be able to do. So you can have all the search engines you want. You can have all the information of the world on your fingertips. But what the machine cannot do for you, the skill that it cannot take away for you, is it cannot know these things. I mean, the machine itself doesn't know anything. There's no consciousness there. But it also doesn't help you to know things to have it in the machine. It's like a library of books that you never read, right? That effort nobody can take away from you, that you have to have that. That's the kind of skill nobody can take away from you without taking away the result as well. You cannot have experience of sunsets. The machine cannot have that for you. There's one thing that never will exist in virtual reality, namely the one who experiences that virtual reality. That must be real. Your consciousness that experiences virtuality must be real. It cannot itself be virtual. So we ourselves cannot be replaced in that way. But what that is, our consciousness is part of our rational soul, our immortal soul, which will outlive this whole world, including its machines. Just to realize our own dignity as the ones who have this experience and who have a mind, who have virtue in ways that nothing can replace, basically, and that will have an eternal destiny. I think, that's for me the eschatological perspective that puts things into perspective here on earth as well.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I think that might be a good place at which to conclude, just to kind of have an eternal gaze or a gaze unto eternity as a backdrop against which we make judgments as to our kind of present formation, the importance that we assign to efficiency, and the way that we take up new technologies and seek to incorporate them healthily in a human culture, all of which are big ticket items, but conversations obviously that will continue for many months and years hence. Any final thoughts, things that kind of came up in the conversation that you wish you had the opportunity to touch on at greater length, or any final commendation?
No, there are many little rabbit holes that one can go down on, but including, what do we, ourselves being in the image and likeness of God,
Mm-hmm.
Our attempts to replace reality with simulations of that sort is really trying to play God in a way to make the image and likeness of God ourselves, which only God can do according to the Book of Wisdom. So really we have to think about ourselves, who we are, and we have come to think of ourselves already on the model of machines. That's the first mistake. And that's why we think machines can be like us. They are really our creations, and they are our tools, and that is their place, and we should keep them in that place.
That's great. All right. Well, thanks so much. Thanks for making the time, and thanks for having the conversation.
You're welcome.
All right. Turning to you then, the listener, thanks so much for tuning into this episode of the Thomistic Institute podcast. We'll look forward to chatting with you again in a couple of weeks. And in the interim, you'll have sweet lectures from interventions on campus with which you can, enrich your own intellectual and spiritual formation. So know of our prayers for you. Please pray for us, and we'll look forward to chatting with you next time on the Thomistic Institute podcast.